When I took my Young Storytellers for Peace to the former Soviet Union in 1986, one of our first stops was Moscow. And one of our first opportunities to tell stories was at the Maltese Embassy. There were about 150 adults gathered for that event. And when we arrived, I had about 8 of the 27 Young Storytellers for Peace with me. I was introduced to the woman who was to be our interpreter that evening. She was a very reserved Russian woman, and as I was explaining our process to her, I said, "Now the children are going to be telling a little bit of their story at a time. They'll stop, and then we'd like you to interpret it, and then they'll continue, and you'll go back and forth until the end. What I'd like to ask you to do, in addition to translating what they say, is to also mirror their sounds and their movement, which would make it much more engaging for the audience hearing it in Russian. First in English, then in Russian. Could you do that?" And she said to me, "But of course." And I had the feeling, just in terms of how she presented, that that may be a challenge for her. And so the children and I began our storytelling evening. Now, this audience was thrilled to see American children because they hadn't seen them before. It was during the Cold War era. And so this was a very exciting event for them, for us too. And so the first storyteller was Heidi. Now, Heidi was 10 years old, but she really looked like she was about 8. She had red hair burnished with orange and gold. She had a separation between her teeth, freckles splashed across her nose. She was our version of Pippi Longstocking. And the story that she was going to tell was the story of the 3 pigs. Now, Heidi was a very animated teller. And as you recall in the story, the wolf comes to the first pig's door and he says, "Well, I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in." But when Heidi was telling it, it was, "And the wolf said, I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in." Like that. The audience loved it. The lady that was serving as our interpreter's eyes widened. And she said to the crowd in Russian, in her very reserved stance, "Well, then, the wolf said, I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in." And that was it. And I thought, oh my, this is going to be a very long evening. Well, by this time, of course, the audience was so into what Heidi was doing that she was even more animated when the wolf came to the second pig's door and said, "Well, then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in." And the woman is looking at Heidi. And I'm sure she's thinking, did I actually volunteer for this? Or was it just handed to me as an assignment? But she looks out at the audience and she says in Russian, but we could tell what she was saying. She said, "Well, then, the wolf said what he said last time." And she stopped. Well, Heidi is very conscious of the translation. And she's looking at this woman and she's realizing that she has not translated what she has just said. And knowing Heidi, little Pippi Longstocking, I thought, I wonder what you're going to do next. And then as I watched, Heidi put her hands on her hips, started tapping her foot, turns to this woman and says to her, "No, no, no," she said, "you have to do it again." And she made the lady do it again. Well, something happened to this woman. She got into it. She got into it not only for Heidi, but for every one of the children and for me as well. She was absolutely amazing. And watching them go back and forth, and seeing the transformation in her was quite breathtaking. And when we were done, at the end of the evening, enjoying the time where the sweets would come out and other things for the children, she came up to me with tears in her eyes. And she said, "Michelle," she said, "I didn't know I could tell stories like this. I haven't felt like this since I was a small child." tell me, please, when are you coming back? We left the Maltese Embassy that night, joined the rest of our storytellers. And the next morning, I had a bit of a debriefing with my young storytellers, ranging in age from 10 to 15. And I said to them, we're here to create peace through story and to create relationships and connections and to share the stories that we have in common that share our values so that we can see indeed we are all one people. But I said to them, peace has different forms. And what you did last night for that interpreter, starting with Heidi, was also an act of peace. And I say that because what you enabled our interpreter, whose name was Svetlana, what you enabled Svetlana to do was to reconnect with a part of herself that had been lost and to weave it back into herself again. And that is inner peace. So we do the work of peace outwardly, and we do the work of peace inwardly. But to the last night, you gave her a gift, and you helped to fulfill our mission. All of you who shared yourselves and your story.